Biden's not just battling for re-election. It's not just political dynamic. He owns the economy. He will rise and fall as the economy does. And right now, that seems to be a downward arrow.
Amazing. And I know that everyone has their own perspective on this. Interesting line on ticket splitters in this poll, Jeannie. 10% of Trump voters back the Democratic candidate for Senate. In 4 states here, 5% of Biden supporters back the Republican. How does that come out in the wash?
Yeah, this is going to be tight. The map always looked much, much better for Republicans. This, poll gives Democrats some hope. I think every light has got to turn green for them to keep the Senate at this point. This is going to be tough, but the incumbents do have some benefit. And of course, you've got Republican candidates that have challenges. You just look at somebody like Carrie Lake, or you look at somebody like Dave McCormick. They have challenges. Now, all these candidates have challenges, but they're running against incumbents. One thing I always tell students when you think about Congress, and this is writ large throughout modern American history, is that people tend to like their representatives and senators. Our people in Washington, for everything we throw at them, they do constituent service really, really well, but they don't like Congress overall. And so that plays itself out in these numbers. People like the incumbents generally. There will be some ticket splitters, but I think for Democrats, the question is, how does Joe Biden do this? And I think one thing he's got to do is make these state races in those 6 to 7 swing states. He's got to be spending as they've started to. And he's going to have to essentially try to make this about Donald Trump and sort of see if he can get a lift from the down ballot, which is quite unusual.
The analysis from the New York Times is really something here, Rick, and it gets to what you were talking about. The findings in this poll are basically unchanged since the last series in November. However, think about what's happened since then. The stock market has gained 25%. Donald Trump's criminal trial has started in New York, and the Biden campaign has put out tens of millions of dollars in advertising. So you put this all together, Rick, and the conclusion is until prices come down at the grocery store and maybe the gas pump, these numbers are not going to change.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. It's certainly not going to change in May. I mean, I hate to say it, but all that money that Biden's spending on TV advertisements, it's awful hard to make numbers change in May or June or July or August, right? I mean, this is why a lot of candidates husband their resources until September, because that's when people really start to focus in on the presidential campaign. But I would say maybe we are seeing some change, because this point that Jeannie makes is important to watch. We've lost local politics in America for the last 20 years. Virtually every election is decided by the top of the ticket. Almost every state right now, excluding the targeted 5 states, basically are chosen for by the candidate. If you're one of the 45 states that aren't going to see a presidential campaign, it's because you're either a Republican state or Democratic state. You have 2 Republican senators or you have 2 Democratic senators. You have a state house and the governor that's just like the same party as the senators. And by and large, very few competitive congressional districts. So if there is indeed, and I'm not sure I'd bet money on it yet, but if indeed there are swing voters this time who, will vote for a president and then a member of the Congress or a senator from a different party, that could change this dynamic of this election different than the last 20 years. But right now, I'd still say all politics is national, and most of these constituencies are going to return to their party.
Something to consider if you've been with us since the beginning of this hour, talking to Seth Kaplan in the outset here about how local could be the future in this world in which national politics are driving the conversation. It's amazing. Jeannie, enter the old folks strategy. With all the money that we're talking about, $15 million, I think it was, for the month of May, the president's team reporting today on Bloomberg is intensifying the outreach to older voters. Volunteers are organizing bingo games in swing states and running ads during daytime shows popular with seniors, such as The Price is Right. Now, I take offense to that because I like The Price is Right, Jeannie, but is this what it's come to? Have we given up on the young voter?
Me too, and I like bingo as well. This poll was devastating for Joe Biden as it pertains to young people. I think we are possibly in the midst of a realignment with Republicans in Donald Trump. Maybe if these numbers hold, which is a big maybe, getting double the number of African-American votes that they've gotten since the early 1960s. Young people, Latino voters, all swinging in his direction. So that's tough. Joe Biden has got to try to get as many of his core supporters out. And right now, the strongest among them are the older voters. And of course, one big challenge for Donald Trump with those supporters that he has are they're also the voters who are less reliable getting out to the polls. So, Donald Trump's going to have to work equally as hard. I think one of the big challenges he has is not just abortion, but early voting. And of course, getting these less than reliable voters out. But yeah, so Joe Biden's got to get in these states. He's got to get local. If it takes, I don't know, getting a game together that us older people like, Joe, so be it. You're not old, Joe.
That's right.
Speaking for myself.
Well, thank you. I don't know. I think my AARP card's on the way. This has become, since I just mentioned this, this has become a game in the newsroom already, Rick. The tiles on the Biden campaign old folks bingo game, I'm seeing a few suggestions already. Hush money, drink Clorox, Covfefe so far, the top three. You know how this stuff works. Rick, is this election going to be decided in the bingo hall?
Well, look, I mean, as Jeannie points out, older people voted a much higher incidence than these younger people that we tend to talk a lot about, and they certainly seem to be appearing to be more intense voters this time than these younger voters. So that does bode well for Joe Biden. Whether bingo will get him there, I don't know. But I also think it's kind of interesting to see what's going on at the Republican Party level. The campaign Trump campaign just put out a memo saying, the RNC is not going to spend so much money this time around. We're going to live off the land. We don't have all this money for these operatives. That could affect turnout.
Yeah. All right, they're back next hour. That's Rick Davis. She is Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel. I feel like a little game of Plinko could solve all of this right now. Kaylee's coming in next for hour 2. Have your pet spayed or neutered. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Seeking context today on Bloomberg through a series of important conversations that you will not hear anywhere else. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. Live from Washington, I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons. And Kaylee, the next conversation we bring our listeners and viewers today is with French President Emmanuel Macron, with some interesting insights on a lot of the stories that we're talking about here domestically and internationally.
Yeah, he sat down for a wide-ranging interview with Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, in Paris, and in large part focused on economic issues, not just domestically in France, but internationally as well, as we get the French view on things like tariffs, for example, and the competition with not just China, but the U.S. in some aspects as well.
It's actually a great opportunity, Kaylee, to slow down, take a breath for 1 minute away from breaking news. Lawmakers are out of town until tomorrow, at least the business part of Congress is quiet till tomorrow. The president's making his way back from Rehoboth Beach, and we have an opportunity to find some real insights today. Looking forward to this one.
Yeah, so we will be bringing that full conversation to you in just a few minutes. First, though, as always, here on Bloomberg Television and Radio, we got to get a check on the markets with Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kaylee Lyons. Little change for the U.S. stock market. That is the key takeaway until we get key economic data tomorrow and Wednesday. CPI retail sales coming up this week. Right now, S&P down by less than half a point, flat on the day. We have got the Dow down 41, drop there of 1/10%. S&P, by the way, swinging between gains and losses. NASDAQ holding on to a 49-point gain, up now by 0.3%. 10-year at 4.47% with a 2-year 4.84%. Spot gold down $24 the ounce, lower now by 1%, while crude oil, West Texas Intermediate, up by 0.6%. Meme stock mania back big time with GameStop shares surging. GameStop up right now by 69%. And some of the other stories that we're following today, sources tell Bloomberg, Walgreens Boots Alliance is reaching out to potential buyers of the $8 billion Boots drugstore chain in the United Kingdom. Shares of Walgreens Boots Alliance up now by 5%. Recapping, S&P down half a point. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York, thank you so much. Meantime, here in Washington, a lot of the conversation in recent days, Joe, has in fact been focused on geopolitics, the U.S. relationship with allies, as well as with adversaries. Of course, Israel policy front and center, but increasingly, especially in the context of the 2024 campaign, trade and competition with both allies and adversaries has been very much in focus as we have the Biden administration getting set tomorrow to announce new tariffs or even higher tariffs on things like Chinese EVs and solar cells. And of course, other countries, in addition to the second largest economy in the world, have to be paying attention to that too.
Well, that's absolutely right. Emmanuel Macron is right in the middle of it. Obviously, as the leader of France, he has unique insights on a number of the issues that you just mentioned in a conversation that we're going to bring you now here on Bloomberg. The tariffs did come up, Kaylee, just one of many topics that arose in this sweeping interview at the Choose France Summit, where the president was invited and brought foreign executives from around the world and has done so for the past 7 years here. Sat down with Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, and they began their conversation on investments in France. Let's listen.
We delivered a lot of reform. Since the very beginning, 2017, tax cuts, flat tax on capital gains. We decreased from 33.3 to 25% corporate taxes. We made a lot of reforms on labor law. And after COVID, during the past 2 years, with inflation, war in Ukraine, we passed reform and on pension scheme and unemployment mechanisms. I don't see a lot of countries around us having done so. So
you don't just want to be compared to Europe, do you?
No. My point is just to say we delivered, we do deliver, and we will deliver. And this is why we will launch this week a new bunch of reform on labor market. We will launch a new bunch of simplification and an attractiveness package for finance, and we will prepare for, we have already launched new simplification, and we will prepare for September a new bunch of reform on labor market. So it's a permanent work. But I see where we come from and where we want to go. France was lagging behind, clearly in Europe, because of too much bureaucracy, a strong system, a lot of strengths, but lack of competitiveness. I think we bridge, I don't think, I see that we clearly bridge the gap with the others, and now we are front runners in Europe. My concern is not just France, is Europe in comparison with US and China. And this is the point you mentioned. During the three past decades, if you take the last 3 decades, we created half of the value per capita created by the US. Why? Lack of innovation, lack of investment. This is the main reason. This is why now my top priority is to have a European policy saying we have to be much more innovative, we have to create a much more efficient capital market, we have to invest much more from a common budget as Europeans and from the private sector. And we have to deliver in parallel our decarbonation, because I do believe that climate, digital, growth and job creation are the 3 pillars of what we have to deliver.
And those, we will go through all of those, but just on that point about the European economy, you had a full-scale attack on it at the Sorbonne, where you said it is sclerotic, it is being left behind. Do you think that, from the EU's point of view, that sclerotic economy is a bigger long-term challenge than, say, Vladimir Putin?
I think this is clearly linked to what's happening as well, but we have to completely reset our model. I think now France clearly is one of the leading economy. We are number 1 in attractiveness. We've been number 1 during the past 5 years. And if you take job creation, growth, we are 1 or 2nd in the Eurozone.
Do you think you're being
held,
so
this is my point. So we are here. Now when I take Europe, and especially the EU as a whole, but it's true as well for UK, we have this issue in terms of business model. Why? Because we had low-cost energy thanks to Russia, production thanks to Central and Eastern European countries with quite low costs, a market for exports, China, and a geopolitical umbrella, US. These pillars are being completely revised, totally.
Yes.
And it's no more valid. So we have to reinvent. What and how? By creating much more value on our own, by being much more innovative, by creating much more jobs, and jobs with value, good jobs, I would say, on our continent. The key point is deliver much more innovation and productivity policy, public and private. So the second key reform is to accelerate decarbonization, and especially our electricity policy, because through renewables and nuclear energy, we can deliver low carbon, sovereign, and low-cost energy, which is much more than importing gas and fossil fuels. Third, we need much more investment based on common budget, and my view, I mean, based on public reports and figures, we need 1 trillion more in terms of budget, in terms of spending. And in parallel, we have to make the capital market union a reality, which is not yet the case.
Can I come on to capital market union? Because you have here an example. You have BNP.
Yeah.
Now probably Europe's and definitely the Eurozone's most successful bank, worth $80 billion. But you know you are entertaining these people like JP Morgan and so on. JP Morgan is worth $550 billion. It's 9 times as big. Bank of America, 4 times as big. And the reason why is BNP Paribas cannot expand throughout the European Union and take over other banks.
This is very true. We have several issues.
You would like to see BNP take over one of these, take over a German bank or an Italian one?
I mean, we do need a consolidation, but we do need as well an actual domestic market as Europeans, which is not the case. We have to deal with 27 regulations. You know, energy, finance, and telco are the key sectors where single market doesn't exist. It was a choice at the very beginning. I do agree that we have now to open this box and to deliver a single market approach. It's much more efficient. So our view is that now we want to elaborate a Franco-German consensus on capital market union to have a single system of resolution, a single supervision, and a much more integrated capital market union.
Would you be happy with, say, Spain's Santander coming and buying Societe Generale? As part of that?
It's part of the market, but dealing as Europeans means that you need consolidation as Europeans.
So it could be cross-border mergers in both directions.
But this one is for banking union. It's already on track. Now we have to do it for capital market union, which is broader
more difficult.
and even more difficult, but we started to do so at a political level during the last council, and I do believe that we can find a Franco-German agreement. But why? I want you to just understand the challenge for us. 75% of our financing as Europeans go through banks and insurance. So we need much more consolidation, but we need a clear circulation of the savings all around the place. This is the first objective, to be much more efficient and to be sure that our savings will be invested in the right sectors and the right geographies. Second, every year, 300 billion savings goes to finance the US economy because we are not attractive. So in parallel with this capital market union and the simplification, having an actual single market, we clearly need the same level playing field as the US in terms of financing, which means when you take solvency and Basel, as long as it's not implemented by the US competitors, it should not be implemented by the European competitors. Otherwise, this is a killer for risk-taking, because these regulations just prevent you, our banks, from investing in equity, which is exactly what we need. And if you take the key driver of this difference between the US and Europe, the key driver is the fact that the US economy innovated and invested much more in equity and innovation than the European economy. I think we did much better during and post-COVID than what we did during the financial crisis. But now this is a totally new world. And we do need this new business model for the Europeans, more innovation, more investment, single market and capital market union, and a relevant trade policy. Because I want to, at this point,
can we come back?
None the US and China are compliant with WTO today. We are the only one in the room to respect just the regulation of WTO. And we are too naive. We are too open. Both of them protect their players and their economies. We have to do the same.
Can we come back to the issue of China later? But just on another French company, Total, you mentioned energy. Total's CEO has talked about moving its primary listing away from France towards New York. Would you be happy with that?
Not at all. And I would be very surprised. No, I wait for any confirmation. I understood it was rumors, so...
But it's interesting that it's tied to the idea that he would face extra ESG measures here that he would not face in America. And he thinks that would affect his valuation.
Do you mean that we are more serious than the US in terms of green economy and transition?
Yes, but you also, in your speech at the Sorbonne, you said, as I'll paraphrase, you said you cannot let decarbonisation and growth be enemies. And this would appear to be an example.
And this is my point. Yeah. But the point is just, we have to be sure when we regulate, we should not over-regulate.
Yes.
And I think now we have to deliver. We need in Europe much more investment. We have to cut red tapes, have more flexibility. But in parallel, everybody has to be serious. I saw a lot of funds, a lot of asset managers saying, we are with you on climate change. Where is the beef? Are you sure you are sufficiently compliant? Are you sure you are clearly addressing the same issues? This is my point. And this is why we need the resynchronization between the US and Europe. The resynchronization is, number one, the US regulation in terms of climate change should be more serious and realigned than the European ones. Second, the Europeans have to invest much more and be more serious and realign themselves on the US.
Can I just ask you about another French company? I've asked you about Total and BNP. LVMH, I looked, and nobody has done better under the Macron presidency than Bernard Arnault. His wealth has increased by 170 billion euros. And he is now the richest man in the world, probably the first Frenchman to have that honour since Napoleon. And I think we can both say bravo to Mr. Arnault. He's done it in a more peaceful way. But it's interesting. You look at the people who've, right at the very top of the wealthiest people in France, they're mostly either heirs or in fashion or both. And I wonder whether that is the kind of France you talked about creating. You always talk about technology, but the people who've done really well are these old-style businesses.
You're right, all of them. I don't think it's an old style of business, but it's a business where we have competitive advantage, luxury, fashion, and so on, because France is one of the great places. And Bernard Arnault consolidated this market very early. He was one of the front runners in this industry. And I think it is very good, and this is a chance for us, because first, we speak about a lot of jobs which are located in France, because a lot of these jobs are impossible to be relocated elsewhere. When you speak about alcohol, when you speak about cognac, armagnac, champagne, fashion, and making a lot of this stuff, it's added value. It's low qualified and very qualified jobs. And in parallel, he consolidated the market elsewhere. And thanks to the fact that he is listed in France, we consolidate a lot of value and value creation elsewhere. And this is why, thanks to Total, LVMH, BNP, and so on, we are the second largest place of the world to list your company.
But there is a tension, isn't there? If I look at all those people, or certainly Hermès, LVMH, Kering, all those ones, they have done spectacularly well by exporting to places like China. They've done very well out of globalization. And all the prescriptions you were just talking about in terms of Europe having higher trade walls, being tougher with China, you know what will happen in a couple of months' time? The Europeans will say, we want to put tariffs on electric vehicles. And what will happen is Mr. Xi, despite what he may have told you last week, he will come back and he will put tariffs on cognac. And that will help those very successful French business people.
Look, I think this is exactly the mistake we made 20 years ago on solar panels, and we killed our industry. I'm very simple. I don't lecture and blackmail anybody. I just look at the picture. When you have tariffs of 10 for Chinese electric vehicles entering into our market, and when you are taxed between 15 and 24 when you go to the Chinese market, you have an issue. And on all the different sectors, what we want is just reciprocity. We want, and in fact, more than that, more just than regarding the relation with China, level playing field. So what we ask for is exactly that. We want to be sure that in terms of tariffs, subsidies, rules of production, we have a fair competition. And I mentioned it very openly to President Xi. So it is not a geopolitical agenda. We don't want to blackmail and push back some of their production. We want to be sure it is fair. It's fair to launch precisely inquiries and look in details at the situation and revise it. If we are weak, if we are threatened by the fact that you can have retortion measures, you just don't do what you have to do. We had this discussion, and this is why they decided not to implement the first measures on cognac, but to withdraw the first one. So I think it's a normal approach, but look at the situation today. The European Union is the most open place of the world. But you cannot survive if at the same time you have subsidies and overcapacities in China and protection in some part of the market, and Inflation Reduction Act and Buy American Act in the US. It doesn't fly 1 second.
So Europe has got to get tougher now.
But this is a necessity, not because we are protectionists, but just because we want to protect our economy.
The Germans do not agree with you about this.
I think it depends whom in Germany and for which perspective. It's totally true that some German companies, when they are incorporated in China, for instance, benefiting from subsidies, not just German, European, American, their interest is probably to preserve that and to sell themselves their overcapacities in China to the rest of the world, and especially the European market. But the German economy's interest is totally aligned with the French economy's interest, meaning creating jobs, creating value, but just protecting your business and your people when they are attacked by unfair measures. And it's normal. It's part of the business. So for me, it's just a no-brainer.
That was an exclusive conversation between French President Emmanuel Macron and Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite in Paris. And so interesting there, Joe, to hear them talking about not just China when it comes to trade and competition, but the U.S. as well. We just heard the French president saying, while the EU is one of the most open places in the world, you can't survive if you have subsidies and overcapacity in China and things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. He specifically mentioned electric vehicles in that conversation.
And we knew that the EV subsidies in the IRA were a problem for a lot of our allies in Europe. But it's interesting today, we just had this fascinating conversation with the president of France, that very same issue, and specifically competition with China by way of tariffs that we expect to be announced as early as tomorrow by the Biden administration came up as well. Our colleague Anne-Marie Hordern caught up with Janet Yellen, who is in Fredericksburg, Virginia, to talk about something altogether different, the use and implementation of infrastructure money. But of course, conversation continues to return to China. Here's what the Treasury Secretary said earlier on Bloomberg.
We do think that the playing field should be fair, and China engages in unfair practices like massive subsidies of industries they have decided are critical. And those are cases where we will act to protect ourselves.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen earlier today. And of course, while the Treasury Secretary was speaking to what the Biden administration is looking to do, which, yes, to be sure, is still protectionist in many ways, Joe, the expansion, potentially elevation of existing tariffs against Chinese goods, it's still a bit more measured than what, say, former President Donald Trump has suggested he would do if he returns to the White House for a second term at the White House, suggesting blanket 60% tariffs on everything coming out of China.
That's true, although it's pretty eye-popping to see a north of 100% tariff we're talking about on Chinese EVs. We'll have a lot more on that tomorrow, Kaylee.
Absolutely. And meantime, today, we have to have a lot more, not on the policies that would be pursued by a second Trump administration, but the way that the presumptive Republican nominee is spending his time these days, including today in court in New York, although his criminal hush money trial is on a lunch break as we speak. We have had hours of testimony from Michael Cohen, his former fixer and attorney, the prosecution's star witness in this case, who has been testifying to his relationship with Donald Trump and what exactly went down with the payments made to catch and kill stories in the National Enquirer in the days leading up to the 2016 election. High drama in the courtroom once again. So how does it factor into his political ambitions? Joining us now is our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. They are Bloomberg Politics contributors. And Jeannie, obviously you are up in New York, where all of this has been going down for several weeks. So much has already been unveiled in this case so far. We already heard last week salacious testimony from Stormy Daniels, but is Michael Cohen the last piece of the puzzle that comes together to create potentially a massive headache for Trump and his campaign?
Yeah, this is what the prosecutors are hoping. This is, the big sort of moment in this trial. He's at the easy part of this at this point, because he's going to have to face, I think, what's going to be a blistering cross-examination, and we'll have to see how he holds up under that. Michael Cohen had a really, really difficult time in front of the Senate, so he had a bit of time to practice with this. By all accounts, this should be a little more tame, but it's going to be tough. And this is the heart of the prosecution's case. And, Donald Trump's team is going to go hard on Michael Cohen. And what I think has been, noteworthy today is that Donald Trump and Michael Cohen have both behaved themselves so far, if you will. And that's what both of their sides wanted them to do, not get emotional, not have any outbursts. And so far, both of them have done that.
I'm reading this fascinating Trump trial blog, live blog on the terminal, Rick, and it is entertaining. It was certainly salacious during Stormy Daniels' testimony, and maybe this will become the same. He's describing hearing about the Access Hollywood tape while on vacation and all the drama that followed. But does any of this actually change anyone's mind politically? I realize it's important to the legal case that's being made, but this is a political program. And if you're a Trump supporter, you know about Michael Cohen already. If you're a Joe Biden supporter, you probably feel the same way, right?
Yeah, it's hard to tell how much voters are really paying much attention to the details of each of these. I mean, we obsess over this, a lot of coverage.
Yeah.
The media, it's extravaganza. But so far, we haven't seen a lot of movement in any of the surveys that we've seen through the course of this. We've now had about 3 or 4 weeks of good sample, and nothing really is moving it. And so I think it's really what you were saying is, like, how does this determine the outcome of the trial? Because there is some clear indication that voters who have concerns about Trump say that they're more likely not to vote for him if he's convicted of a crime, and is certainly in that case. So clearly, this is the probably biggest headline star in the case,
filled
next to Stormy Daniels herself. And I think the distinction he's already made today was in his testimony that this wasn't about Melania. Trump didn't seem to care about Melania finding this stuff out. It was all about making sure he could get elected and getting through the election. And I think that's because really this is an election finance case. It's got really less to do with the salacious details of having an affair with a porn star or a Playboy model, and a lot more to do with hiding the money and keeping it from the public view, which would have become public if they had adhered to strict campaign finance laws. So I think we're now starting to see the case turn to that issue more than just the sort of salacious details of the relationship.
So we know, Rick, that Michael Cohen's in the courtroom, as well as the prosecutors, Trump's attorneys, Donald Trump himself, but there were a few other members of Congress who decided to show up and show support for the former president today. Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York was there. Senator Tommy Tuberville, Coach, as you may know him. Senator J.D. Vance, who has also been listed on the at least reported short list of potential vice presidential candidates who would be on the ticket alongside Donald Trump. But Donald Trump said this weekend at least one person is not on that short list, Rick, Nikki Haley. Does that surprise you?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, they never really made up. She hasn't endorsed him after her withdrawing from the primary campaign. And it's a constant reminder to him that she hasn't done that, because there are still people, as much as 20%, who are voting for her in the primary against him, even as he has already accumulated enough delegates to become the nominee. So she is an irritant to Donald Trump. Now, if it goes beyond irritant to the point where he insults her enough that those voters who are Republican voters don't show up in the general election, could actually cost him. So I was actually surprised he was as negative toward her as he was in his response to questions about whether or not he would consider her for VP. Doesn't seem to care about that 20%, but I sure would if I was running his campaign.
We spent some time talking earlier about the new Siena poll, new Siena College poll that's out today with New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, and it's not good news for Joe Biden. Jeannie, who's losing to Donald Trump in a majority of swing states, covered here. When you consider the weekend that Donald Trump had on the Jersey Shore, big rally, huge turnout. He referred to Alvin Bragg as Fat Alvin. He talked about Juan Merchan, the judge, of course, presiding over the trials, quote, highly conflicted, unquote. Talked more about how the case is doing the bidding of President Biden. He'll probably, I'm assuming, face more concerns about violating the gag order in this case. But when you look at that Siena poll, getting back to what Rick said a little earlier, is any of this moving the needle on the campaign trail? Because it looks like they're existing in two separate worlds.
It sure doesn't seem to be. I mean, the first takeaway from this poll is consistency. It is consistent with what we have seen over and over again, almost since the fall. So, you know, the trial, at least so far, hasn't seemed to move the needle. And I would say, you know, local officials on the Jersey Shore, I don't know if Snooki was there, who was there, they're saying 80, 100,000 people turned out. Those are big numbers for Donald Trump. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and call this VP race for Doug Burgum. I think that was the story of the weekend. You know, speaking of Nikki, yeah, there we go. Speaking of Nikki Haley, she's a big problem. These so quote unquote zombie voters who are increasing numbers. It was Indiana, to Rick's point, 22%. But Doug Burgum helps to alleviate some of that challenge. So between his money, which is another problem Donald Trump has, the Nikki Haley voters, and abortion, I'm saying my bet is on Doug Burgum at this point. A really good showing for Doug Burgum out there on the campaign trail for Donald Trump. And I know JD Vance is in the courtroom today, but he hasn't won me over yet on this VP race. Not that it matters.
Okay, so Jeannie makes her call.
Yeah, we're marking this down. What do we have here? 13th of May, Jeannie Burgum. Got it.
Yep, noted. Putting it on our little checkerboard here. Bingo card, maybe? I don't know.
It's where they're going to
Something
win
like
the campaign.
that. We're all going to be playing this game probably up until the day before the Republican convention starts in July. But Jeannie, just on this New York Times Siena poll, when you look at the demographic figures as well, perhaps it spells trouble for the Biden campaign. They're essentially tied with Trump among 18 to 29-year-olds and Hispanic voters, even though Biden got more than 60% of the vote of both of those groups in 2020. And Mr. Trump wins support of more than 20% of black voters, which is the highest level of support for any Republican presidential candidate since the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Jeannie, when you look at figures like that, what's most concerning?
That is the most concerning thing about this poll. Exactly what you just said, Kaylee. You know, the idea that Trump could, if the election was held today, double the number of African Americans who support him is just stunning. It's historic. It suggests we are in a period of realignment. And boy, does the Biden team know this. If you look at his schedule for this week, the NAACP, he's going to Morehouse to do the commencement. He's talking at the African American Museum. I mean, they are going to try desperately to shore up this black vote, which he really does need. And he's got some work to do on that because Donald Trump is doing what no other Republican has been able to do in decades, which is he is attractive to African American, particularly young voters. Joe Biden's best hope here is that they don't come out in as much numbers as you know, some of the elderly people who support Joe Biden.
Well, I'm fascinated by that answer, Rick. A period of realignment. If that's the case, how do Republicans seize on it?
Well, I mean, there already has been quite a bit of realignment with Donald Trump. What we saw in 2016 was his ability to get blue-collar, white, rural males especially, who had been voting Democratic for most of their lives to switch over and start voting Republican. And became really the basis of the MAGA movement. The question now is there further movement toward that realignment? It's certainly not your grandfather's Republican Party, but the reality is I think they still fall along the lines of education and income and geography. If you are a black male without a college education, you're going to be more likely to vote for Trump, regardless of your skin color. Same with Hispanics. And what we're seeing is, you know, where you live matters. If you live in an urban area or suburb, less likely to vote for Donald Trump. So, you know, these are the realignments that are happening. Whether or not it continues in force this election cycle, too early to tell. I would say the thing that upsets the apple cart is turnout. In 2020, we saw the largest turnout in 100 years. 70% of the voters said, hey, I'm interested in this outcome and I care. This time, every single survey we're seeing says, you know what, I don't care about the rematch. It is not interesting to me, and I don't want to vote. And so you have almost half the country now saying, don't count on me to be an election day voter. That changes the model completely, and how that model, you know, changes, we may not know until election day.
Really smart analysis today from Rick and Jeannie, our signature panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our Bloomberg Politics contributors. Thank you both for weighing in here. I guess the big question remains, if this is a period of realignment, will it outlast Donald Trump? I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. We've got a lot more ahead, starting with world and national news. Let's do that right now with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. President Biden is expected to announce tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and sharply increase levies for other key industries this week. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the Biden administration wants to make sure American businesses are protected.
Given that China is really not playing by the rules in the sense they have enormous subsidies in critical areas of advanced manufacturing, has resulted in overcapacity.
Yellen was speaking exclusively to Bloomberg. Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial back underway in New York City. Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's former lawyer and personal fixer, on the witness stand to offer jurors an insider's view of the dealings at the heart of the case. Now, he's by far the most important witness in this case, and his appearance signals that the trial is entering its final stretch. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg World Headquarters. I'm Charlie Pellet. 1:40 on Wall Street. We begin with a developing story. Headline on the Bloomberg Professional Service. Kraft Heinz said to be exploring the sale of Oscar Mayer. That, according to the Wall Street Journal, could fetch upwards of $3 to $5 billion. Again, that according to the Wall Street Journal. Kraft Heinz shares, they're up by almost 1%. The Dow and S&P now in the red. Stocks have been wavering as traders map out the game plan for the CPI report. S&P down 0.1%. The Dow down 0.2%. NASDAQ lower by higher now by 0.2%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.47%, 2-year 4.84%, gold down 1%, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.8%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet with a look at the day's trading. Thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where for much of the last week, conversation really has been dominated by a policy shift in some instances the Biden administration has undergone in regard to Israel. A decision last week to withhold a shipment of large bombs to Israel over concern that they may be used in Rafah, Gazan city, in which more than 1 million Palestinians have sought refuge and shelter. And administration officials this weekend, Joe, standing by the decision.
Yeah, that's for sure. We talked about it a lot in this space as it was happening. Of course, the White House might bristle at the idea of this being reflected as a change in policy, but it certainly feels like one to a lot of lawmakers. And as a result, Kaylee, there's an effort afoot on Capitol Hill by the very small Republican majority here, the Republican conference pushing a resolution to ensure funding for Israel. It might be something we see get some attention this week.
Yeah, certainly something we're going to keep an eye on, just as we were keeping an eye on of the messaging with the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who was asked about this on one of the Sunday shows over the weekend. And this is what he said about the administration's thinking on these weapons for Israel.
We don't have double standards. We treat Israel, one of our closest allies and partners, just as we would treat any other country, including in assessing something like international humanitarian law and its compliance with that law. I would invite people to read the report. They can see for themselves everything that we've laid out in the report. The report also makes clear that this is an incredibly complex military environment.
Speaking on NBC's Meet the Press, the Secretary of State talking about the report submitted to Congress at the end of last week that raises concerns about Israel's use of U.S.-provided weapons in theater. But as we mentioned, there is a resolution that could see the light of day in the U.S. House this week that would ensure funding, military support for Israel. And joining us to talk about this and a few other stories, Congressman Chuck Fleischmann, the Republican from Tennessee's 3rd District. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, you can see is literally in the field here doing constituent services. And Congressman, I appreciate your stopping your day for us as you prepare to return to Washington this week. Will the House pass that resolution? What do you think needs to happen?
Well, I think so. We need to be unequivocal in our support for Israel.
Having trouble hearing the congressman.
We need to be unequivocal in our support for Israel. Absolutely. After what happened to Israel on October the 7th, the United States needs to back its ally in the Middle East, Israel, in its right to defend its borders and its right to fix the situation with Hamas in Gaza. And we do not need to pause. We do not need to be vague. We need to be 100% behind Israel so they can wrap this situation up, deter terrorism wherever it exists in the Middle East, and move forward.
Well, Congressman, at the end of the day, though, knowing that this is largely a messaging bill, is there any further action that you would like to see your chamber take that is not just largely symbolic and meant to send a message to the White House?
Well, we were more than symbolic when we passed aid to Israel. We've passed it time and time again through the appropriations packages, through the supplementals and the like. But our speaker, our leaders, our membership has been on the Republican side overwhelming. Even Democrats have joined us. Many Democrats have joined us, as they should. Support for Israel needs to be bipartisan, needs to be bicameral, and we need it to start from the White House. We need to tell Joe Biden loud and clear, unequivocally, that he's got to support Israel. No pauses, no ifs, ands, or buts. Support Israel get them the aid, get them the arms, let them secure their borders, complete this mission, and then let's work for peace in the Middle East.
Are you concerned about the findings in the State Department report, Congressman, that questions some of Israel's tactics in using U.S.-provided weapons in Gaza? Should Congress be concerned about this?
I'm personally not. October the 7th, Hamas was not concerned when they went in, raped, pillaged, plundered, killed, engaged in terroristic acts that are unspeakable, unfathomable. This was an incursion into the sovereign state of Israel, which cannot be ever tolerated, can never be condoned. So no, war is heck.
Order
War
filled.
is horrible, and casualties happen in war that are sometimes unintended. But remember this, in the streets of Gaza, they were celebrating on October the 8th when Israel had been hit and terrorized. They still have American hostages. They still have Israeli hostages. Hamas is not giving them up until Hamas decides to do the right thing, give up the hostages, and agree to stop incursions into Israel. Think about it. They're still wanting to fire rockets into Israel. They're still calling for the destruction of Israel. So again, the United States needs to be unequivocal in its support for Israel, for funding, for arms, for diplomatic aid, anything that it takes to secure Israel's position in the Middle East with its neighbors.
So we'll look to see further action from the House in regard to Israel this week.